The emergency room doors at Callaway Ridge Medical Center shattered open at 11:47 p.m. Not from a gurney, not from a patient, but from 12 armed soldiers in full tactical gear, weapons raised, moving in tight formation through the lobby like they owned the building. The head nurse screamed, a janitor dropped his mop and ran. The unit commander stopped in the center of the room, looked directly at the chief physician standing behind the nurse's station, and spoke 4 words that turned every face white. Where is she? Now. 40 minutes earlier, they had thrown her out. Before we go further, if you're watching this for the first time, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because I drop new stories every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Tap the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Mara Sloan had worked the overnight shift at Callaway Ridge Medical Center for 14 months, and in that time she had become the kind of nurse people noticed for all the wrong reasons. She dropped a patient chart on her 3rd day and spent 10 minutes picking up scattered pages while 2 residents pretended not to watch. She once walked into the wrong trauma bay during a drill and stood there long enough that Dr. Felix Hargrove, the chief of emergency medicine and a man who wore his credentials the way other men wore expensive watches, made a comment about it at the next department meeting. Nothing pointed, just a remark about making sure all staff understood the floor layout. Delivered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Everyone in the room understood exactly who he was talking about. Mara understood too. She sat in the 2nd row and wrote down the date in the margin of her notepad. She was quiet in a way that made people uncomfortable, not because she said strange things, but because she almost never said anything at all unless it was necessary. She answered questions directly and briefly. She didn't laugh at jokes that weren't funny. She didn't cluster at the nurse's station during slow hours to trade gossip about attendings. She did her work, documented everything, and went home. 14 months, and nobody really knew her last name without checking the schedule. What they saw was a slightly awkward woman in her mid-30s with dark circles under her eyes and a habit of moving along the edges of rooms rather than through the middle of them. She wore her hair back in a way that looked functional rather than styled. Her scrubs were always clean but never pressed. She carried a battered steel water bottle she refilled 4 times a shift and never left at the station where it might get moved or misplaced. That detail, the water bottle, was the kind of thing people mentioned when they described her afterward. Small, careful habits. Nothing that flagged as significant until you already knew what you were looking for. What nobody at Callaway Ridge knew, because she had spent 3 years making sure of it, was that Mara Sloan was not her real name. The night that changed everything started like most bad nights do, with something that seemed routine. A 14-year-old boy came in through triage at 9:20 p.m. with his mother beside him, both of them damp from the rain outside. The boy, whose name was Devin, had a laceration on his forearm from falling off a chain-link fence in his backyard. Deep, but not arterial. He needed cleaning, closure, and a tetanus booster. Standard. The triage nurse sent them to exam room 4 and flagged it low priority. Mara picked up the case and went in. Devin was sitting on the edge of the exam table with his arm held stiff at his side, and his mother was standing near the door in a way that said she'd been in ERs before and didn't particularly trust them. Mara introduced herself, gloved up, and began assessing the wound. It was while she was cleaning the laceration that she noticed the boy's breathing. She didn't say anything at first. She finished the initial clean, stepped back, and watched him take 3 more breaths. Then she looked at the pulse ox reading on the monitor and watched the number sit at 97, which was fine on paper, and then she watched it again. "Devin," she said, "can you take a deep breath for me?" He did. It was slightly labored. Not dramatically, not the kind of thing that jumps out at you, but there was a quality to it, a faint resistance at the top of the inhale that she had heard before in conditions that had nothing to do with a fence fall. "Has he had any shortness of breath lately?" she asked the mother. "Even mild? Just felt like he couldn't quite fill his lungs?" The mother frowned. "A little. We figured it was allergies. Why?" "It's just the cut on his arm." Mara nodded slowly and said she wanted to ask the attending to take a look before they closed the wound. She stepped out of the room, found Dr. Hargrove at the station reviewing imaging for another patient, and told him she wanted a chest listen on the 14-year-old in room 4. He looked at her over his reading glasses with an expression she recognized from every male authority figure she had encountered in two entirely different careers. The laceration case? Yes. His breathing pattern is slightly off. I want to rule out a spontaneous pneumothorax before we close and discharge. Dr. Felix Hargrove lowered the imaging tablet and gave her the kind of measured pause that was specifically designed to communicate that whatever she had just said was not worth the time it took to hear it. His SATs are 97. I know, but the quality of the breath at the top of the inhale, the quality, the effort. There's a slight change in Nurse Sloan. His voice dropped just enough. He fell off a fence. His SATs are fine. Go close the LAC, give him his booster, and discharge. We have 6 patients waiting. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds longer than felt comfortable. Then she said, "Understood," and went back into room 4. She closed the laceration. She administered the booster. She went through the discharge instructions with the mother, and then she paused at the door and turned back. "One more thing," she said. "If he complains of any chest tightness tonight, any at all, or if his breathing feels worse, take him straight to the nearest ER. Don't wait until morning. Can you promise me that?" The mother looked at her carefully. "Should I be worried?" "I think he's probably fine," Mara said, which was true in the sense that she wasn't certain. "But I'd feel better knowing you had that," the mother promised. Mara documented the exchange, flagged the discharge notes with a respiratory observation, and moved on to her next patient. She didn't see Devin again that night, but she thought about him for the rest of her shift in the way you think about something you're not allowed to do anything about. The incident that ended her career at Callaway Ridge happened 3 hours later, and it had nothing to do with Devin. It happened in Trauma Bay 1. A man had been brought in by ambulance at 12:14 a.m., construction worker, late 50s, found unresponsive at a job site. The paramedics had him on a backboard with cervical precautions, IV access established, and they were rattling off vitals as they transferred him to the bay table. BP was 88/54 and dropping. Pulse was weak and rapid. GCS was 9. Dr. Hargrove took the lead, called for imaging, ordered a fluid bolus, and began working through the standard trauma protocol with 2 residents flanking him. Mara was pulling supply drawers at the back of the bay, handing off materials as they were called for, staying out of the way. She was tearing open a pressure bandage packaging when she looked at the patient's neck. Not at the brace, at the skin of his neck, just above the collarbone on the left side, where there was a very subtle but unmistakable distension of the jugular vein that was asymmetric, more pronounced on one side. And his trachea, she noticed, was not sitting quite centered. She looked at the monitor. The rhythm was sinus tach with occasional PVCs, which everyone was watching. She looked at his chest. The rise was uneven, barely, and the diminished side was on the right. "Dr. Hargrove," she said. He was in the middle of talking to the residents and didn't respond. "Dr. Hargrove." She stepped closer. "I think he may have a tension pneumothorax." The room went quiet in that specific way that happens when someone junior says something that stops a room and the senior physician has to decide in real time whether to engage or shut it down. Hargrove turned to look at her. "His chest X-ray is in queue." "I know, but his trachea is deviated. The JVD is asymmetric. His BP is in the 80s and tanking, and the breath sounds on the right." She hesitated. "If I could just listen for 30 seconds. You want to stop a trauma protocol, to do a secondary listen based on your visual assessment." It wasn't really a question. "I'm saying I think the X-ray might be too slow." "The X-ray is 40 seconds out." His voice was very controlled. "Step back and let us work." She stepped back. She stood at the edge of the bay and watched the monitor and counted in her head, and at 16 seconds the patient's blood pressure alarmed, and at 23 seconds the rhythm started breaking down into something that was no longer just tachycardia, and she had already moved before she finished thinking about it. She was at the supply cart, her hand was on a 14-gauge angiocath, and she said, "He's crashing. You need to needle the right chest, now." "Nurse," Hargrove's voice cracked like a whip. "Do not touch that patient. He has a tension pneumo. The pressure is collapsing his heart. If you don't decompress him in the next 60 seconds, security." He didn't look away from her. "Get her out." The X-ray came up on the monitor 18 seconds later. The image showed a complete right-sided pneumothorax with mediastinal shift. She watched Hargrove look at the image. She watched him reach for the needle decompression kit. She watched him do exactly what she had told him to do, and she watched the patient's blood pressure begin a slow, unsteady climb back from the edge. Then she felt the security guard's hand on her arm. "Ma'am, I need you to step outside." She didn't fight it. She let him walk her out of the trauma bay, through the double doors, and into the hallway where the fluorescent lights hummed and a janitor with a cart full of mop supplies looked at her and then looked away. She stood in the hallway. Inside the trauma bay, she could hear the team working, controlled voices, equipment sounds, the specific cadence of a resuscitation that was going the right direction. She had done that. Whatever Dr. Hargrove would write in his notes, whatever version of events would make it into the record, she had done that. It didn't matter. She already knew it wouldn't matter. Felix Hargrove came out of the trauma bay 11 minutes later. He had taken off his gloves but hadn't changed his expression since she'd last seen his face, which was the expression of a man who had been made to look incompetent in front of his team by someone who had no right to do it. He stopped in front of her in the hallway and was quiet for a moment. "That was a serious breach of protocol," he said. "The patient is alive. You attempted to intervene in an active trauma resuscitation without authorization. You grabbed a needle decompression kit. I didn't use it. I indicated where it was. You caused a disruption in the trauma bay that put the patient at risk." She looked at him steadily. "You want to say that again?" His jaw tightened. "You are a liability. You have been a liability for 14 months. You second-guess attending physicians. You disrupt workflow. You demonstrate a consistent pattern of overstepping your scope. He would have died. That is not—" He stopped, lowered his voice. "That is not your call to make, Nurse Sloan, and it is especially not your call to make in my trauma bay in front of my residents." There it was, in front of his residents. "I understand," she said. "No, I don't think you do." He held up a badge lanyard that she recognized as her own. She hadn't noticed when it had been removed. "Your access to this hospital is terminated effective immediately. HR will send your paperwork in the morning. Security will escort you out." She took the lanyard from his hand, looked at it, set it on the nurse's station counter. "You should document that the chest X-ray confirmed the tension pneumothorax," she said quietly, "and that needle decompression resolved it, for the patient's record." Hargrove stared at her. "Have a good night, Dr. Hargrove." She walked to her locker, got her coat and her battered steel water bottle, and went through the exit door into the wet dark of the parking lot. The rain was still coming down. She stood under the overhang at the edge of the ambulance bay and let the cold air work against her face while her eyes adjusted to the dark. She was calm, not the performed calm she wore inside the building, but a deeper stillness that sat under everything, had always been there, and didn't need managing. She had known tonight would come. Not specifically, not this exact sequence, but the shape of it, the inevitability of a system finding a reason to remove the thing that didn't fit. She had told herself she was past caring about that. She had told herself that 14 months of boring, invisible competence had successfully buried the person she used to be. She was looking at her phone, not reading anything, just looking at the lock screen, when she heard the first siren. Single vehicle, from the sound of it, coming fast from the direction of the interstate, which meant trauma bay. She told herself it wasn't her concern. She put her phone in her coat pocket. She looked at her car, 40 feet away across the wet asphalt, and calculated that she could be home in 25 minutes. The ambulance turned into the bay with its lights strobing red and white across the wet ground, and the back doors opened before it had fully stopped, and she saw the paramedics come off the vehicle fast in a particular way, the way they moved when they were genuinely scared about what they were carrying. She didn't move toward them. She made herself not move toward them. She watched them wheel the gurney through the bay doors, and she got one look at the patient as they passed. Military-age male, 40-something, dressed in civilian clothes but with the particular physical bearing that doesn't wash off, unconscious, and his skin was wrong. Not pale the way shock patients are pale. Wrong in a different way. There was a mottled quality to the exposed skin on his neck and forearms, a faint perioral discoloration that she had not seen in an emergency room in the 3 years she'd been working in emergency rooms. She had seen it in a tent in a place she didn't say the name of anymore, a long time ago, in a man who had been in a storage facility where he wasn't supposed to be. She stood very still. The bay doors closed. She counted 60 seconds. She actually counted, standing in the rain. And then she put her water bottle down on the ground next to the overhang pillar, crossed the parking lot, and went to the ambulance bay side entrance that she knew had a 40-second delay on the lock rotation after an incoming vehicle. She pressed her palm flat against the wall beside the door, felt the mechanism, and slipped inside. She moved through the service corridor parallel to the main hallway, which she had used twice before in non-emergency situations, and had never forgotten because she forgot very few things about spaces she moved through. She could hear voices from Trauma Bay 1, Dr. Hargrove directing the team, a resident calling out vitals, the mechanical sounds of equipment being deployed. She stopped outside the bay door and listened. BP is 74/40 and falling, heart rate 122. He's got some kind of rash on his neck and arms. Could be an allergic reaction. Get me epi. Hold on the epi. That was Hargrove. Could be contact dermatitis. Could be... His pupils are unequal. That could be head trauma from the accident. He wasn't in an accident, one of the paramedics said. We got called to a hotel parking lot. He was found on the ground next to his car. No collision, no impact trauma that we could find. He just collapsed. She pushed through the door. 3 people turned to look at her. Hargrove's face went through surprise and then anger in about a second and a half. I called security. The rash isn't allergic, and it's not dermatitis. She was already moving toward the patient, pulling gloves from the box on the wall. Look at the distribution. It's on his forearms and neck, exposure pattern, not a systemic allergic response. And the pupil asymmetry with that skin presentation means you're not looking at trauma. Get her out of here. What was he near? She looked at the paramedic who had spoken. At the hotel lot. Was there anything at the scene? A vehicle? A container? Any smell that you noticed? The paramedic, a young woman in her late 20s who was already looking between Mara and Hargrove with the expression of someone doing rapid math, said, There was a van, parked a couple of spaces over. One of the responding officers said it smelled chemical, like a cleaning product but wrong somehow. They roped it off. Okay. Mara had her gloves on. She looked at the patient's eyes. The left pupil was blown, the right was mid-range and barely reactive. She looked at the skin presentation again, at the faint blue undertone in the tissue around his mouth. She looked at his fingers. You need to treat this as an organophosphate exposure, not overdose, not trauma, not allergy. Someone contact poison control right now and tell them you have a suspected chemical agent exposure in a male, approximately 40 to 45 years old, presenting with meiosis, skin breakdown, altered consciousness, and cardiovascular collapse. The room was very quiet. And you need to pull atropine, she continued, her voice exactly the same as it always was, flat, direct, no performance in it. A lot of it. And pralidoxime if you have it in this facility. If you don't, you need to get it transferred from... Stop, Hargrove's voice. You do not work here. You are not authorized to be in this building. I will have you arrested. Then arrest me. She looked at him. But pull the atropine first. On the monitor, the patient's heart rate jumped and then dropped. The alarm went off. The resident closest to the medication cart was already moving before Hargrove said another word. She worked for 11 minutes alongside a team that had mostly stopped questioning her and started following her lead without anyone explicitly making that decision. The resident, whose name tag said Kaplan, was sharp and picked up on the treatment protocol fast. Hargrove stood at the edge of the bay for the first few minutes. And then he was beside the patient too, his hands moving, because he was ultimately a physician, and the patient in front of him was dying. And there are some things that override ego, even in men who have very large amounts of it. The patient's pressure stabilized at 96/60. Not good, but no longer falling. She stepped back from the table and stripped her gloves and looked at her hands for a moment. An old habit, checking. Then she looked at the patient's face. Something pulled at the edge of her memory. Not the face, she didn't recognize the face, but the hands. A specific scar on the web of his right thumb, a small curved line she had seen before in a context that made her stomach go cold. She was still looking at that scar when the sound came from outside. Not an alarm, not a siren. Vehicles. Multiple, heavy, moving in coordination. She knew that sound the way you know something you've been trained to recognize before you're consciously aware of processing it. She was already stepping toward the window in the bay door when the lobby doors at the end of the main hallway burst open and the shouting started and the tactical lights swept through the glass. 12 soldiers in full kit, moving fast, spreading through the lobby in a pattern that was not crowd control and was not a welfare check. It was a secure and hold formation. She had run that formation. She had trained people to run that formation. The unit commander stopped in the center of the lobby, looked at the staff frozen behind the nurse's station, and said it again. The 4 words she had heard from outside through the overhang, the words that had brought her back inside faster than anything else could have. "Where is she? Now!" And then a different voice, female, clipped, with a specific regional accent she recognized from a base in a state she hadn't been to in 3 years. Check the trauma bays. She wouldn't have gone far, not with a patient presenting like that. Mara stood very still in the doorway of Trauma Bay 1. She had been so careful. 14 months of careful. New name, new city, new identity, built from documents that were technically legal and practically invisible. She had told herself the past was surgically removed, that the woman she used to be had been filed away somewhere with a date of death that nobody would look too closely at. The female soldier came around the corner of the main hallway and stopped 12 feet away from her. They looked at each other. The soldier's expression didn't change. It was the kind of face that had learned not to broadcast anything. But something moved behind her eyes, something that looked like relief crossed with a more complicated emotion. "Boss is dead," the soldier said quietly. It wasn't a greeting, it was information, delivered with the understanding that it would mean something specific. Mara felt the floor shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the building. "Which one?" she said. Her voice was steady. "The son." A pause. "He's been looking for you for 2 years, and that man on your table," she glanced into the trauma bay, "is the only person alive who knows what he was carrying when he died." From the lobby, the unit commander's voice again, directed at Hargrove, who had followed Mara into the hallway. "This facility is now under federal jurisdiction. Nobody enters or exits until we've completed a security assessment. The nurse who just treated your patient, you will tell me exactly what she did and in what order. And then you will tell me where you found her." Hargrove looked at Mara. For the first time in 14 months, he had absolutely no idea what to say. Hargrove's mouth opened and closed once, and then he did something she had never seen him do in 14 months. He stepped back. Not physically, though he did that too. He stepped back in the way that men like him do when the architecture of their authority suddenly has no walls to hold it up. When the person they've been talking down to is standing in the same hallway as 12 armed soldiers in a federal override and the math has stopped working in their favor. Mara didn't look at him. She was looking at the soldier. The soldier's name tape said Rourke. She was compact, dark-haired, somewhere in her mid-30s, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent years making herself hard to read in rooms where being readable was a liability. Mara knew the type because she had been the type, and there was a specific quality to the way Rourke was watching her. Not surveillance, not threat assessment. Something closer to relief with a hard shell around it. "How long?" Mara asked. "Since we confirmed the exposure pattern on the vehicle 40 minutes ago. We pulled the hotel security footage and had a face match in about 8 minutes. After that, it was just tracking where they'd taken him." "You knew he was here before I did." "We knew he was at this facility. We didn't know—" Rourke paused, and something shifted in her expression, something that wasn't quite discomfort, but was adjacent to it. "We didn't know you were here. That was separate." Mara looked at her for a long moment. "Was it?" Rourke didn't answer. From inside Trauma Bay 1, the resident Kaplan called out a blood pressure update, 101/64, still climbing, and the sound of it pulled Mara's attention back to the patient. She turned, went back into the bay, and stood at the foot of the bed looking at the man on the table. His color was marginally better. His breathing had evened out. The atropine was working, though the window on how long it would hold was something she couldn't calculate without knowing exactly what he'd been exposed to, at what concentration, and for how long. The scar on his right thumb was still bothering her. "What's his name?" she asked. Rourke had followed her into the bay. She looked at the patient and then at Mara. "Marcus Drell." The name landed like something dropped from a height. Mara kept her face neutral with the kind of deliberate effort that didn't show because she'd had a long time to practice it. She looked at Drell's face, really looked, now that she had the name to organize the features around. And she could see it. The years had done their work. He was heavier in the jaw, had a scar above his left eyebrow that hadn't been there before, and his hair had gone from dark brown to a gray that was mostly gray. but the structure underneath was the same. He was running point on the Callahan inquiry, she said. Her voice stayed flat. When I filed the initial report, he was the one who told me the documentation would be reviewed. It was reviewed. It was buried. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Yes. Mara looked at her. And now he's on my table. Now he's on your table with a drive containing 47 months of financial and operational records for a weapons diversion network that runs through 3 defense contractors and at least 1 active duty command structure. Rourke's voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that had learned to deliver bad news without announcement. Someone knew he was moving it. The chemical exposure was targeted. This wasn't random. Mara looked back at Drell. His chest was rising and falling with the slow, careful rhythm of someone whose body was still fighting hard to stay on the right side of a very thin line. She had spent 3 years believing that Marcus Drell was one of the people who had let her disappear. She still believed it. It was possible to believe it and also understand that the man in front of her needed to survive, because those 2 things didn't have to be reconciled tonight. He needs a specialist unit, she said. Toxicology, critical care, and someone who's worked chemical exposure cases outside of a hospital setting. This facility doesn't have the depth for what comes next. We have a medical team en route. How far out? 40 minutes. She did the math. His pressure will hold if nothing else shifts. But if there's a secondary absorption, if he got any dermal contact in addition to respiratory, you could see another drop in the next 20 to 30 minutes, and it'll be faster than the first one. Can you hold him? She looked at the monitor, looked at the IV lines, looked at the supply situation in the bay, and then at Kaplan, who was watching her with the expression of someone who had stopped being sure who was in charge and had quietly decided it was probably her. I can hold him, she said. What happened in the next 22 minutes was not smooth. It was not the kind of medical sequence that plays out clean in any story or any training scenario. It was the kind of work that involves a lot of small decisions made with incomplete information, and some of them are right and some of them are wrong, and you don't always know which is which until several minutes after the fact. The secondary pressure drop came at the 19-minute mark, exactly as she had calculated it might, and it came faster than the first one. BP went from 98/62 to 71/44 in under 3 minutes, and the rhythm on the monitor started showing the kind of irregularities that don't wait for anyone to finish thinking. She called for a second line, pushed additional atropine, and made a judgment call on fluid resuscitation that she was not fully certain about, and said so out loud to Kaplan, because she had learned a long time ago that saying, "I'm not sure, but here's what I'm doing, and here's why," was more useful to everyone in the room than performing certainty you didn't have. Kaplan held the second line steady with hands that shook slightly and then stopped shaking. He was young, maybe 29, and he had the specific look of someone who had gone through a medical program, rigorous enough to teach him a lot of things, but hadn't yet had enough of the unstructured emergencies that teach you how to stay inside your own head when everything is going wrong at once. I was learning it in real time tonight. She could see it happening. "Talk to me," she said at one point, not because she needed information, but because she needed him to stay verbal. "Pressure is coming up," he said. 78/50, 82, 85. "Good, keep watching the rhythm. If you see another run of those PVCs, tell me before you do anything else." "Yeah, okay." She had 3 soldiers standing at the bay entrance, not interfering, just present. And Rourke was on a communication device in the hallway outside, and somewhere in the building she could hear Hargrove's voice, though she couldn't make out the words. And the sound of it was small and somehow less substantial than it had ever felt when he was using it to dismiss her. Marcus Drell's blood pressure stabilized at 94/58. She stood at the bedside and watched the monitor for 4 minutes without moving, just watching, the way you watch something you've pulled back from an edge to make sure it's not going to go again. Then she pulled off her gloves, dropped them in the biohazard container, and sat down on the rolling stool in the corner of the bay, because her legs had been telling her for the past 10 minutes that they had opinions about all of this, and she had been ignoring them. She was still sitting there when Rourke came back in. "Team is 20 minutes out," Rourke said. "His numbers look better. For now. You've got him this far." "Kaplan's got him." She looked at the resident who was documenting on the bay terminal with focused, methodical keystrokes. "He's good. He just needed someone to not panic in front of him." Rourke looked at Kaplan and then back at Mara. I need to brief you before the team arrives. On Drell. On everything. They used the dictation room off the main hallway. Small, fluorescent lit, a single table with 2 chairs and a whiteboard somebody had used for a scheduling chart that hadn't been erased. Rourke closed the door. She sat across from Mara and put a sealed case on the table between them, roughly the size of a hardcover book, matte black with a biometric strip on the side. She didn't open it. What do you know about the name Talbert Group? Rourke said. Mara thought about it. Defense contractor, mid-tier. They do logistics and supply chain work for domestic installations, some overseas. They were under a routine audit 18 months ago. She paused. Or they were supposed to be. The audit was shut down 6 weeks in. The analyst running it was reassigned to a desk in Guam. Rourke's voice was very even. The Talbert Group has been running a shadow supply channel for 3 years. Equipment, material, controlled substances from military medical stockpiles. The channel goes through 3 staging facilities, 1 in Nevada, 2 on the East Coast, and the product is going to buyers that are not on any sanctioned list. Mara looked at the sealed case. And Drell had documentation. Drell spent 14 months building it, quietly, unofficially. He couldn't go through official channels because at least 2 of the people who would need to approve an investigation are connected to the network. Who's running it on the military side? Rourke was quiet for a moment. A name you know, she said finally. The room felt smaller. Say it, Mara said. Garrett Voss. Colonel, Joint Logistics Command, 14 commendations, currently being considered for a 2nd star. Rourke's eyes didn't move from Mara's face. I was on the review board that ruled your original report unsubstantiated 3 years ago. Mara sat with that for a moment. She had filed that report on a Tuesday in February in an office building 300 miles from where she was sitting right now, and she had walked out of the building 2 hours later knowing that the filing was the end of one thing and the beginning of something else. And she had been right, but she had not known then that the person who closed the door was Garrett Voss. She had known a Garrett Voss. He had been a lieutenant colonel then, respected, decorated, the kind of officer people described as old school in a way that was meant as a compliment. She had briefed him twice on medical operations and found him competent and brisk and faintly condescending in the way that certain ranks performed towards certain other ranks, which she had taken as unremarkable because it was unremarkable. She thought about the way he had nodded at her during the second briefing. Thoughtful nod, attentive expression, all the signals of a man who was listening. 3 years ago, I handed documentation to a review board, she said. Her voice was steady. Personnel files, supply chain records, 2 affidavits from soldiers who were willing to go on record. The board told me the material was insufficient and the case was closed. Within 6 weeks, I was separated from service on a performance evaluation that bore no relationship to any performance evaluation I'd ever received. We know. And Voss sat on that board. He chaired it. She looked at the table. There was a small gouge in the laminate surface near the edge, and she focused on it for a moment the way you focus on a small fixed thing when you need to keep the larger thing from becoming something you can't contain. What do you need from me? She said. Drell was carrying a secondary set of files on that drive, everything he'd built on the network, but also everything he'd reconstructed about the original inquiry. Your report. What happened to it? The names of the people who signed off on the burial. Rourke leaned forward slightly. The drive is locked. Biometric and voice authentication. 2-key system. Drell is 1 key. And the other? Rourke looked at her. Mara was quiet for a moment. He keyed it to me. There's a voice and biometric profile on the secondary lock under the designation Sergeant First Class Lena Marsh. Rourke's voice was careful. Which is the name you served under? Lena Marsh. She had not heard that name spoken aloud by another person in 3 years. It moved through her like something cold and very old. He knew where I was, she said. Not a question. He knew you were in a hospital in this city under a different name. He didn't pull on the thread because... Rourke stopped. He said in his notes that he didn't want to blow your cover until he had something solid enough to make it worth it. Mara absorbed that. There were multiple things in it to absorb, and she wasn't going to be able to do all of them right now, so she set most of them aside and kept the operational piece. He's unconscious, she said. He can't authenticate. Not right now. When he stabilizes, if he stabilizes fully enough to go through a biometric and voice protocol, that's a minimum of 24 to 48 hours out. The drive is useless until then. That's why we need you to authenticate your half now. If we have your piece, we can begin extracting the files that don't require dual authorization. There are subfiles, preliminary data, communication logs that are single-keyed to you. She looked at the case on the table. The biometric strip on the side was dark, waiting. If I authenticate, she said, I'm in this. No more Mara Sloan. No more quiet nurse at Callaway Ridge who drops charts and stays invisible. That was always going to end tonight, Rourke said quietly. You know that. Mara looked at the wall. There was a coffee stain on the whiteboard frame that nobody had bothered to wipe off, probably from 6 months ago. The kind of small evidence of real human occupation that accumulates in working spaces and goes unnoticed by the people who pass it every day. She thought about Devon from earlier in the night, the 14-year-old with the fence laceration and the breathing pattern nobody else had noticed. She thought about the discharge instructions she'd given his mother, the slight catch in the woman's expression when Mara had said, "Take him in if anything feels worse." She thought about the fact that she would never know how Devon was doing, because Mara Sloan was not a person who was going to be at Callaway Ridge tomorrow. She reached across the table and put her thumb on the biometric strip. The case emitted a soft tone. State name and service designation, a synthetic voice said. She looked at Rourke. Rourke looked back at her. Lena Marsh, she said, Sergeant First Class, Unit Designation 6 Alpha Tango 7. The case clicked open. But the files that came out of the first authentication layer were not what she expected, and she had expected a lot. She had spent 3 years telling herself that whatever had happened with her original report was contained, that the damage was real but bounded, that the thing she'd walked away from was bad but finite. The files told her a different story. The communication logs alone ran to hundreds of entries spanning 31 months, coded language, but not very creative code, the kind of operational shorthand that people use when they feel secure, when they believe the system is working for them and not against them. She read enough of it in the first 10 minutes to understand the architecture. The Talbert Group was a logistics shell with legitimate contracts used to mask a parallel supply movement. The product pulled from military medical stockpiles, pharmaceuticals, biological agents, specialized equipment, was being funneled to a commercial intermediary that had connections to at least 2 international buyers that the files named only by account number. But that wasn't the part that stopped her. The part that stopped her was a file sublabeled Origin 7, buried 3 folders deep, which contained scanned documents she recognized. Not because she'd seen them recently, because she'd written some of them. Her original report, intact. The full version, not the redacted summary that the review board had processed. Personnel records. Supply chain discrepancies. Both affidavits, names intact, in the versions she had submitted before they came back to her sanitized. And attached to the original submission documents was a routing record showing exactly who had seen the full files, in what order, and what they had done with them. Garrett Voss had received the complete package on a Thursday. He had forwarded a summary, stripped of the affidavits and the specific supply chain records, to the formal review board the following Monday. He had flagged the case to the board chair as low credibility, and on the same Thursday that he'd received her full report, he had sent a separate communication, not through official channels, through a personal account that the logs had captured through metadata, to an address that corresponded to the Talbert Group's primary legal contact. That communication had 3 words in the body. It's been contained. She sat in the dictation room with the case open on the table and the files scrolling on the small screen embedded in the lid, and she looked at those 3 words for a long time. 14 months of careful. A new name, a new city, a smaller life built around invisibility, and the belief that staying quiet was the same as staying safe. She had done all of that because she had thought the thing she'd uncovered was a vulnerability in a system that would eventually close around her if she kept pushing. She had thought it was dangerous but bounded. She had not understood until right now, reading a 3-word message from a colonel to a defense contractor on the same day her career ended, that the danger had never stopped. It had just been waiting for her to be easy to find. Rourke came back into the dictation room at that point, closed the door, and looked at Mara's face. "You found the routing record," she said. "He flagged me to them 3 years ago, when I filed the report." "Yes." "Which means they've known where I was." Rourke sat down across from her and was quiet for a moment in a way that was not evasiveness but careful preparation. "The flagging was 3 years ago. After that, and we believe this is why Drell didn't push harder on your location until recently. There was an internal disagreement within the network about how to handle you. One faction wanted you found. Another argued that a discharged medic who'd gone quiet was less of a risk than the noise that would come from any direct action. So they decided to leave me alone as long as I stayed invisible. Until 7 weeks ago, Drell sent a communication that the network intercepted. It was coded, but they had enough to know he was building a case and that he'd found a secondary source. Rourke's voice stayed even. You were the secondary source. They didn't know your current name or location, but they knew you were out there, and they knew that if Drell made contact, the full original documentation could come back. Mara looked at the screen, at the 3 words. And Drell knew they were looking, she said. He moved the drive 6 times in the past 4 weeks. Tonight was supposed to be a handoff to a federal contact, someone outside the normal channels, someone clean. The hotel parking lot was the meeting point. Rourke paused. The federal contact was found dead in his car 2 miles from the hotel, gunshot. The chemical exposure on Drell was separate, something they'd already set in motion before the meeting, planning to let it look like a medical event. The room was very still. They knew about the meeting, Mara said. They had someone inside the coordination. She let that sit. Someone inside. Not outside pressure, not surveillance. Someone who knew the plan, the location, the timing. Someone in a position to know those things. Who else knew about tonight's handoff, she said. Rourke's expression shifted by a degree that was barely visible and completely readable. On our side, 4 people. One of whom we now have questions about, yes. Mara closed the case and sat back in the chair. The fluorescent light in the dictation room hummed at a frequency that was slightly off. Not quite 60 cycles, something a little faster. The kind of thing you don't notice unless you're sitting very still in a very quiet room. I need to see Drell, she said. He's still unconscious. I know. I need to see him anyway. She wasn't sure why she needed it exactly. Not medically, something else. She wanted to look at his face again now that she knew what she knew. Now that she had the routing record, and the 3 words, and the understanding that the same man who had buried her report had put her in the crosshairs of people who were willing to use chemical agents in hotel parking lots. She wanted to look at Drell and decide what she thought about the fact that he had spent 14 months quietly building the case that might undo all of it, and had keyed part of the lock to her, and had never once reached out directly. She stood up, picked up the case, looked at Rourke. The military team that's coming, she said. The one that's 8 minutes out? About that, yes. Who cleared them? Rourke didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. Rourke. They were cleared through the standard deployment protocol, but given what we just discussed about internal access, you don't know if the team is clean. I know most of them are. I don't know about the commanding officer. He was attached to this operation through a referral from... She stopped. From a contact that we now have questions about. Mara looked at the door of the dictation room. On the other side of that door was a hallway, and at the end of the hallway was Marcus Drell, unconscious on a table with 47 months of documentation locked in a drive that 2 people in the world could open, and in approximately 8 minutes, a military medical team was going to arrive. And one of the people responsible for deploying that team might be working for the same network that had already killed a federal contact tonight and used a chemical agent on Drell and spent 3 years waiting for Lena Marsh to surface. I need that drive moved, she said, before the team gets here. I can't authorize. I'm not asking you to authorize it. She met Rourke's eyes. I'm telling you what needs to happen. If the drive is here when that team arrives and the CO is dirty, the whole thing ends tonight. Everything Drell built, gone. And if I move it and the CO is clean, I've just created an unauthorized chain of custody breach on federal evidence. Yes. Rourke looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the case in Mara's hand. Where would you move it? She said. Mara thought about it. Not long, sub. The architecture of the problem was clear. She needed somewhere that wasn't this building, wasn't accessible to anyone on the incoming team, and was reachable in under 8 minutes. She thought about the service corridor, the ambulance bay, the parking lot. She thought about a detail that Rourke had mentioned earlier, that Drell had moved the drive 6 times in 4 weeks, which meant he had infrastructure, safe points, places that weren't obvious. His vehicle, she said. At the hotel. You said the scene was roped off. It is. Who's holding the perimeter? Local police, 2 of our people. Are your people on the ground ones you trust? Rourke thought for exactly 2 seconds. Yes. Then the drive goes back to the hotel, original location, before the incoming team gets here, before anyone starts a formal evidence inventory. If the CO is dirty, he'll be looking for it here, not back at the scene. She paused. If he's clean, it doesn't matter. The drive is still in federal custody, just a different point in the chain. Rourke was quiet for a long moment. Then she took out her radio. The call took 4 minutes. The transfer authorization, worded carefully enough to be defensible and vague enough not to be traceable to a specific decision, was processed by one of Rourke's ground team at the hotel, who confirmed receipt at the 11-minute mark after the arriving military medical team's vehicles were already visible in the Callaway Ridge parking lot. Mara had gone back to the trauma bay. She stood at Drell's bedside. His color was better, his pressure had held, his eyes were closed, and his face in unconsciousness had the particular quality that faces have when all the deliberate construction of expression is absent. Less the face of a man with 14 commendations and a cleared record and a board review that had ruined her, more just the face of a middle-aged man who had been poisoned in a parking lot and was breathing carefully on the edge of his own survival. She did not feel what she'd expected to feel standing here. She'd thought it would be something larger, anger, or the resolution of anger. Instead, it was something quieter and less clean. The understanding that the thing she'd been running from for 3 years was not actually behind her. It had been ahead of her the whole time. The trauma bay doors swung open. She turned. The military team entered in 2-person formation, medic gear visible, moving with practiced efficiency. The commanding officer came in third, late 40s, lean, with the angular face of someone who'd spent a lot of time in the field and not much time being comfortable. His name tape said MC Dade. He scanned the room fast, patient, monitor, equipment, personnel, and then his eyes landed on Mara and stayed there 1 second longer than was necessary. Not recognition, something else. Assessment. Who's been managing the patient, he said. I have, Mara said. And you are? She held his gaze. The drive was gone. Drell was stable. Rourke was somewhere in the building, and the 2 ground team members at the hotel were people Rourke trusted. The question was what Colonel Garrett Voss knew about tonight, and how quickly he was going to know that the plan had stopped working. I'm the nurse Dr. Hargrove fired 4 hours ago, she said. McDade looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the monitor, then back at her. Walk me through what you gave him, he said. She began to speak. Behind McDade, one of his medics moved to the patient's other side and began a systematic assessment, and she watched the medic's hands while she talked, watching for the specific things you watch for when you don't know if someone in your room is who they say they are. McDade asked 3 clinical questions in a row, each one slightly more specific than the last, and all 3 were legitimate. She answered them directly. He nodded at each answer with the minimal, compressed acknowledgement of someone processing information rather than performing interest. He might be clean, he might not. She wouldn't know until something happened that told her, and she could not control when or how that something arrived. What she could control was what she did before it got here. Her phone, the cheap prepaid she'd been carrying for 8 months under Mara Sloan's name, buzzed once in her coat pocket. She kept her expression neutral. She kept talking to McDade about the atropine protocol. When there was a natural pause, she pulled out the phone and looked at the screen. 1 message. No name. A number she didn't recognize. 4 words. Voss knows you're there. She put the phone back in her coat pocket without changing her expression and kept talking to McDade about the pralidoxime dosing window, because stopping mid-sentence to react to a 4-word text message in a room full of people she didn't fully trust was not something she was going to do. McDade was nodding at the dosing information with the focused attention of someone running a parallel calculation, absorbing what she was saying while his eyes moved around the room in the specific pattern of a person assessing exits and personnel and threat geometry at the same time. She noticed it because she did the same thing, had been doing it since she walked back into this building 3 hours ago. The question of whether he was doing it because he was competent or because he was compromised was one she didn't have enough data to answer yet. The secondary drop? When did it occur relative to initial presentation? He said. 19 minutes post-arrival, faster than the first, consistent with continued dermal absorption on top of the primary respiratory exposure. And you managed it with? Additional atropine, fluid resuscitation, second IV access. I made a judgment call on the fluid volume that I wasn't fully certain about. It worked, but I want that documented accurately. What I knew and what I was guessing. McDade looked at her for a moment. Most physicians and most officers, when told that a treatment decision involved uncertainty, responded in one of two ways. They either got defensive on behalf of the outcome, because the outcome was good and uncertainty threatened the narrative, or they got genuinely interested because they were the kind of person who understood that honest documentation of uncertainty was more useful than a clean story. McDade said, "What was the uncertainty?" Fluid volume in an organophosphate case with cardiovascular compromise. Too little and the pressure doesn't recover. Too much, and you stress a heart that's already working against acetylcholinesterase inhibition. I went with a moderate bolus and watched the response. It went the right direction. But it might not have. But it might not have, she agreed. He nodded. Not approval, exactly. More like recognition of something. His medic on the other side of the bed, a young man whose name tape said Fortis, looked up from his assessment. His pupils are coming back toward equal. Left is still slightly larger, but it's tracking. Good, McDade said. Then to Mara. You staying? She held his gaze. 4 words from an unknown number sitting in her coat pocket. Voss knows you're there, which meant Voss had someone feeding him information from inside this operation, and that someone had access to enough detail to know she was at Callaway Ridge, and the medical team standing in front of her had been deployed through a channel that Rourke had already flagged as potentially compromised. I'm staying, she said. Rourke found her in the hallway 90 seconds later, which meant Rourke had been watching the trauma bay through the door window and had timed the exit precisely. Mara showed her the phone. Rourke read the message, looked up, and said nothing for 3 seconds. Unknown number, Mara said. Could be Drell's secondary contact. He had cutouts, people who knew pieces of the operation but not the whole structure. Or it's someone inside the incoming team who's telling me because they don't want to be here when this goes wrong. Or it's disinformation, sent to make you run. Mara had considered that. She'd been considering it since she put the phone back in her pocket. Running was the thing that made sense if the message was genuine. Running was also exactly what someone would want her to do if the message was designed to clear the room. If I run, Drell is alone with a team that may or may not be clean. The drive is at the hotel with 2 people Rourke trusts but hasn't verified in the last hour, and Voss has no reason to escalate because the problem has removed itself. She kept her voice low, barely above ambient sound. If you stay and Voss has a direct action team moving, you're in the building when they get here. How long would it take him to mobilize something? He just found out his chemical operation failed. Drell is alive. The drive is unaccounted for. Rourke thought about it in the precise, rapid way of someone doing tactical math under time pressure. 40 minutes minimum. Probably an hour if he has to bring people in from outside the city. Then I have 40 minutes. To do what? Mara looked back at the trauma bay through the small window in the door. Drell was visible from this angle. The top of his head, one arm, the IV line running from the crook of his elbow. He was still unconscious, but his color was continuing to improve, and Fortis was monitoring with the attentive, quiet competence of someone who hadn't done anything alarming yet. Drell has to wake up, she said. That's what Voss needs to prevent. Not me, not Rourke, not the drive at the hotel. Drell conscious and able to authenticate the full file set is the thing that ends this. If Voss gets to him before he wakes up, he's in a hospital. He can't move him. He doesn't need to move him. Rourke went still. A secondary exposure, Mara said quietly. Something introduced at the bedside. Something that looks like a complication of what he already has. Clean enough that the first assumption is medical, not deliberate. By the time anyone looks harder, it's done. She watched Rourke's face process that. McDade, Rourke said. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not McDade directly. Could be Fortis. Could be someone else on the team who has access to the bay and a reason to be near the patient. She paused. I need eyes on Drell every minute until he's either transferred or awake enough to talk. Not medical eyes. Constant. I can put my people in the bay. Your people are 2 soldiers in a hospital lobby, and Voss knows this facility. He knows the layout, the access points, the staffing pattern. He has someone inside, which means he's been fed information about this building that goes beyond what you'd get from a floor plan. She stopped. Who cleared this location as the receiving facility? Rourke's expression shifted. Who made the call to bring Drell here? Mara pressed. The paramedics made the initial call based on proximity and… Rourke stopped. The dispatch was routed through a coordination center, standard protocol for high-priority medical transports. Who approved the coordination center's routing decision? The duty officer on our side. Name. A pause. Captain Solis. Is Solis one of the 4 people who knew about tonight's handoff? The fluorescent light in the hallway hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, a cart with a squeaky wheel moved past an intersection, the sound arriving and fading in the way that ambient sounds do in large buildings at night, present and then absent without marking the transition. Yes, Rourke said. Solis is one of the 4. Mara looked at the trauma bay door. Get your people in that room, both of them, now. Nobody touches Drell's lines without you or me present. Nobody adjusts his medication, nobody adds anything to his IV, nobody is alone with him for any reason. She held Rourke's gaze. And find out where Solis is right now. Rourke already had her radio out. Solis was not at the coordination center. Rourke got that information in under 4 minutes, which meant someone at the center had been expecting the question and had a prepared answer, or it meant Solis had simply left, which was its own kind of answer. His last logged location was the coordination center at 11:22 p.m. It was now 1:47 a.m. He had not checked out. His vehicle was still in the center's lot. He's in the city, Rourke said when she came back. Somewhere without his vehicle, which means someone picked him up. Or he's dead, Mara said, because that was the other possibility, and not saying it didn't make it less real. Rourke's jaw tightened. We don't know that. No, we don't. She didn't push it further. What we know is that the person who routed Drell to this specific facility may be compromised or may be gone, and either way someone knows we're here with a live patient and an unrecovered drive. She had been moving while she talked, back toward the trauma bay, and now she pushed through the door and looked at the room. Rourke's 2 soldiers, a man named Geary and a woman named Taft, were positioned at the edges of the bay, not blocking the medical team but present, and clearly not going anywhere. McDade glanced at them when Mara came in, then at her, and something moved across his face that she still couldn't fully categorize. His temperature is coming up, Fortis said. 99.1. Not alarming, but it wasn't elevated before. It's a response pattern, Mara said, moving to the bedside. The organophosphate metabolization produces a low-grade inflammatory response in some patients. Watch it, but it doesn't change the protocol unless it goes past 101. She looked at Drell's face while she said it. His eyelids had a faint movement to them. Not waking, not RM, something in between that sometimes preceded a return to consciousness in patients whose neurological disruption was chemical rather than structural. Has he had any response to stimulation? She asked Fortis. I did a sternal rub about 10 minutes ago. He pulled away. Weak, but present. She reached out and pressed 2 fingers firmly against the back of Drell's hand. A different stimulus, different nerve pathway. For a moment, nothing. Then his fingers moved, a slow curl, and his brow contracted into something that looked like discomfort. He was closer than they'd thought. He could be intermittently conscious in the next 30 to 40 minutes, she said, to the room, to McDade, to Rourke, who was now standing inside the bay doorway. If he comes up, it may not be clean. Organophosphate recovery can involve significant confusion, agitation, combativeness. Don't restrain him unless he's going to hurt himself. Talk to him by name, orient him slowly, don't give him a lot of information at once. You've managed this before, McDade said. Not a question. Yes. Where? She looked at him directly. Not somewhere I'm going to discuss in this room. The answer landed cleanly. He nodded once and went back to the monitor. But it was at the 2:09 a.m. mark that the first thing happened that confirmed what she'd been afraid of. Fortis asked to take a medication bag from the secondary supply cart, a standard request. Nothing flagged about the phrasing or the manner. And when Geary stepped to verify the bag before it went to the patient, the way Mara had quietly instructed her own people to do, Fortis hesitated. Not long. A half second. Most people would not have noticed. Mara noticed because she was watching for it, and she noticed the specific quality of the hesitation. Not confusion, not frustration at a process he didn't expect. Something else. A recalibration. He presented the bag. Geary checked the label, checked the lot number, set it on the counter, and nodded. Fortis connected it to the secondary IV port without further incident. She stood at the other side of the bed and watched the drip rate in the monitor for 3 minutes. Nothing changed. The bag was what the label said it was. But she did not take her eyes off Fortis for the next 17 minutes. At 2:26 a.m., McDade stepped out of the bay to take a communication. He was gone for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Mara counted. Fortis moved to the IV pole at the 2:28 mark, ostensibly to adjust the flow rate. The adjustment was minor, the kind of micro-correction that looks like attentiveness. He had a supply pouch on his left hip, standard medic configuration. His right hand made the flow adjustment. His left hand stayed at his side. She was directly across the bed from him. "Fortis," she said. He looked up. "What's the current rate set to?" 125 over the hour. "The order is 100. Back it down." It was a real discrepancy. She had checked the rate 20 minutes earlier. But that wasn't why she said it. She said it to get his hands visible, both of them, before they did anything she hadn't seen. He reached up with his right hand to adjust. His left came up to steady the pole. Empty. She let out a slow breath through her nose. She was not certain. She was not going to act on not certain. What she was going to do was stay in this room and not leave Drell's side for any reason that was not a genuine medical necessity, because not certain was still close enough to the edge that she wasn't willing to put distance between herself and the patient. McDade came back in at the 2:30 mark. He looked at her and then at Drell. "ETA on the transfer authorization is about an hour," he said. "Once we have it, we move him to a secure facility." "Where?" "Classified." "I need to know before the transfer." "That's not standard." "I know it's not standard. I need to know anyway." McDade looked at her for a moment. Then he named a facility, a military medical installation about 60 miles north that she knew by reputation, had no red flags on, and was a plausible destination for a case like this. "Who authorized the transfer facility?" she said. "Colonel Voss, Joint Logistics Command. He's the senior officer on this operation." The room went very quiet inside her head. She kept her face completely still. She was aware of Rourke in the doorway not moving. She was aware of Geary and Taft and Fortis and the monitor and the sound of Drell's IV drip. McDade had just told her, in full sincerity and with no apparent awareness of what he was saying, that the man who had buried her report and flagged her to a criminal network and sent a 3-word message to a defense contractor on the day her career ended. That man had authorized the facility where Marcus Drell, the only person with the documentation to bring him down, was going to be taken in 1 hour. McDade was clean. She was now certain of it, and it was the worst version of certain. "I need a moment," she said. Her voice was steady. With Agent Rourke." McDade nodded. "Professional. Uncomplicated." She walked to the doorway, stepped past Rourke into the hall, and pulled the door almost closed behind her. "Voss authorized the transfer," she said, barely above a whisper. Rourke's face did something complicated and brief. He doesn't have the authority to unilaterally. He has enough authority to put his name on the paperwork, and if McDade doesn't know the politics of this operation, he's going to follow that order because it's a colonel's order, and he's a major. She looked at Rourke. "How long before you can get someone above Voss's level on the phone?" "At 2:30 in the morning, with enough clearance to countermand a colonel's transfer order on an active federal operation." Rourke was calculating. "I have 2 names. Maybe one of them is reachable." "You have less than an hour." "I know. And if neither of them is reachable, then I need another way to delay the transfer, medical grounds, something that means Drell can't be moved." Mara looked back through the window in the bay door. Drell was visible, still unconscious, but his face was doing more things now, the subtle micro-expressions of someone in a lighter level of unconsciousness. He was coming up. Slowly, unevenly, but coming. "If he wakes up before the transfer," she said, "and he can authenticate the drive, the full file set is accessible. Even if Voss moves him after that, the data is already out. The transfer doesn't matter anymore. If he wakes up, he's closer than anyone in that room thinks except me." You can't count on it. No. She looked at Rourke. Make the calls. I'll stay with Drell. Rourke moved down the hallway, phone already in hand. Mara pushed back into the bay. The 40 minutes that followed were the kind of time that doesn't move in a straight line. They moved in the way that high-stakes waiting always moves, stretching in some places, compressing in others, marked not by clock intervals but by small observable changes in the patient's state that told her where she was in a process she couldn't fully control. At 2:41 a.m., Drell's blood pressure climbed to 108/70, better than it had been at any point since arrival. At 2:48, he swallowed. An involuntary reflex, barely visible, but she caught it. At 2:53, he moved his right hand deliberately. Not a twitch, not a pain response. A purposeful movement, reaching toward something that wasn't there. McDade saw it too. He's surfacing. Yes. We should sedate for the transfer. Movement risk, IV integrity. No sedation. Her voice was flat. He's recovering from a cholinergic crisis. Additional CNS depression right now could push him back into compromise. No sedation until he's been awake and responsive for at least 30 minutes. That's... McDade stopped. He was working through it medically, and she could see him arrive at the conclusion that she was correct, which was inconvenient for the transfer timeline, and he knew it. The transfer order. The transfer order doesn't override medical judgment at the bedside. You know that. He did know that. He also knew something had shifted in the room in the past hour and couldn't fully identify what it was, or why the nurse who'd been fired from this hospital seemed to have a level of operational awareness that extended considerably beyond nursing. He was too professional to ask directly, and she wasn't going to explain. At 3:04 a.m., Marcus Drell opened his eyes. Not fully and not cleanly. They opened to a slit, unfocused, with the particular blankness of someone whose brain was rebooting from a complete shutdown. He breathed in slowly and then out, and then his eyes opened another fraction, and he made a sound that was not a word but was the precursor to one. Marcus. She leaned into his field of view, close enough for him to focus. You're in a hospital. You're safe. Don't try to move. His eyes tracked toward her voice. Slowly, unevenly. Don't try to talk yet. Just listen. You're at Callaway Ridge Medical Center. You were exposed to a chemical agent. We've been treating you for approximately 3 hours. You're going to be okay. His mouth moved. Don't. She put 2 fingers lightly on his forearm, below the IV site. Not yet. He stopped. She watched his eyes do the work of processing. It was not fast and it was not smooth. She could see the effort of it, the way consciousness was assembling itself from pieces that the chemical exposure had scattered. He blinked twice. His focus sharpened incrementally, and then his eyes found her face and stayed there, and something moved in them that was recognition. Not of Mara Sloan. Of something older than that. His lips moved again, carefully, like someone testing whether the mechanism still worked. Marsh, he said, barely audible. Hoarse from the intubation attempt they hadn't needed and the general assault of the past 4 hours on his respiratory system. But clear. Yes, she said. His right hand moved toward her. She didn't take it. She put her hand flat on the bed rail where he could see it. Drive, he said. It's secure. Don't worry about it. His eyes moved around the room. A slow, incomplete survey, taking in the soldiers, the medical team, the equipment. I was building the picture. Not fast enough, but building. Time, he said. 3:04 a.m. Something crossed his face. He knew what that meant relative to the timeline of his operation. She could see him arriving at the conclusion. Solis, he said. We know. Rourke is handling it. He looked at her for a long moment. He was working on something. She could see the effort, the concentration required to assemble a thought complex enough to say, and then he said it. Voss has a pause, a breath, a second location, not the installation. Another breath. Rourke doesn't... He stopped, something flickering in his expression that looked like physical pain from the exertion of speaking. Doesn't know about it. Tell me. The transfer. Don't let them... His hand moved, and this time she did take it, not for comfort, but to give him something to press against, because he was working too hard, and she needed him to get the information out before the effort set him back. The installation is a decoy. If he moves me, he won't move you. If he moves me, there's a secondary point, a handoff. The paperwork looks like the installation, but the route, He closed his eyes for 2 seconds, opened them. There's a way station, 40 miles out, not 60. Industrial district. I have the coordinates in the drive. Secondary file, labeled maintenance. She held his hand steady and looked at him. He was gray with exhaustion and the aftermath of the exposure. His voice was fraying at the edges, and he was using what he had to give her something she needed. I've got it, she said. Rest. Marsh. His fingers tightened slightly. I'm sorry about the inquiry. I should have. Later, she said. He looked at her and then slowly let his head settle back. She straightened up, looked at Geary across the bed. Don't let anyone move him, for any reason, until I'm back. She went into the hallway. Rourke was at the end of the corridor, phone pressed hard to her ear, her back to the wall. She looked up when she saw Mara coming. Mara held up a hand. 1 minute. She took out her own phone. The unknown number from earlier was still in her recent messages. She looked at it for a moment. 4 words. Voss knows you're there. Sent at a time when someone inside the operation would have been the only source. And then she called it back. It rang twice. A man's voice answered, low, careful, the voice of someone who had been waiting for a call they weren't sure would come. Are you still in the building? He said. Who are you? She said. A pause. Someone who's been watching this operation for 8 months and doesn't want tonight to go the way Voss needs it to go. Another pause. I know about the transfer, I know about the installation, and I know what's actually at the 40-mile point. She went very still. How do you know about the 40-mile point? Because I helped Voss build it, the man said, and I've been trying to find a way to take it apart for 6 months. His voice shifted slightly. Not in content, but in quality. Something that might have been exhaustion or might have been the specific weight of a person who had been carrying something heavy for too long. My name is Solis, and I need you to listen to me very carefully because I have about 3 minutes before they realize I'm not where they left me. Down the hallway, the trauma bay door swung open and Fortis stepped out, moving with purpose, and when he saw Mara standing in the corridor, he stopped. They looked at each other across 15 feet of empty hallway. His hand moved toward his supply pouch. She said Solis's name into the phone, hold, and put it in her coat pocket without ending the call. Fortis was 15 feet away, and his hand had stopped moving toward the supply pouch the moment she looked at him directly, which told her something. A person acting on instinct or training would have continued the movement. A person recalibrating because they'd been seen would stop exactly the way he'd stopped. She walked toward him. Not fast, not slow. The same pace she used when crossing a trauma bay to reach a supply cart, purposeful and unremarkable. She watched his hand and his eyes and the subtle shift in his weight distribution that happened when people decided whether to commit to something or pull back from it. Fortis, she said, when she was close enough that her voice wouldn't carry to the bay door behind him. I need the pouch. He looked at her. His jaw was set, and his eyes were doing the rapid assessment that people do when they're calculating whether a situation has passed the point of options. He was young, maybe 26, 27, not hardened. Someone who had agreed to something and was now standing inside the consequences of it, which was a different thing from being a true believer. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Your left pouch, the secondary compartment, whatever's in there that isn't on your standard kit manifest. She stopped 2 feet from him. I watched your hands at the IV pole. You didn't do it, which means you either got cold feet or you were waiting for a better moment. Either way, I need what's in that pouch before you decide the moment has arrived. His throat moved. I have a phone call on hold, she said quietly, with a man named Solis, who I believe is going to tell me in about 2 minutes who gave you your instructions. I already have a working theory. So you can give me the pouch, and we can have a very different conversation than the one that happens if Geary and Taft come out of that room and we do this the other way. Fortis looked at the bay door, looked at her, then he unclipped the pouch from his hip and held it out. She took it without breaking eye contact, unzipped it with one hand. Inside, beneath a layer of standard materials arranged to look complete, was a small sealed vial. No label, clear liquid, the kind of packaging that exists in legitimate medical contexts, and also in contexts that are not legitimate at all. She re-zipped the pouch, put it in her own coat pocket, and looked at him. Go sit in the waiting area, she said. Don't talk to anyone. Don't use your phone. If you move before I come back for you, Geary follows you, and the conversation gets considerably worse. He went. She watched him walk to the end of the hallway and through the door to the waiting area, and then she went back to Rourke, who had watched all of this from 12 feet away with the expression of someone revising their assessment of a situation in real time. "Fortis is done," Mara said. "I have a secondary agent from his kit. It needs to go to your forensics people. I want it identified, and I want the chain of custody clean from this moment." She held up the pouch. "And I have Solace on the phone." Rourke took the pouch carefully, sealed it in an evidence bag she produced from her vest with the practiced efficiency of someone who carried them habitually, and looked up. "Solace called you back?" "I called the unknown number. It was him." She took out her phone. The call was still live. She put it on speaker, low volume, and held it between them. "Solis?" she said. "Still there?" "Still here." The voice was strained. "I have maybe 90 seconds. Listen." He talked fast, in the compressed syntax of someone who had rehearsed the essential version of a much longer story. What came out in the next 80 seconds was this. He had been assigned to Voss's logistics operation 14 months ago as a support officer, cleared through standard channels, and had not known for the first 4 months what the operation actually was. By the time he understood the full structure, he was 6 months in and had handled enough material that his fingerprints were on things that could be used against him. Voss had explained this to him calmly, as a fact, the way you explain weather. He had been inside it since then, not because he believed in it, but because the exit door had been locked from the outside. He had been the one to route Drell's ambulance to Callaway Ridge, not because Voss told him to, but because Callaway Ridge was the facility farthest from the 40-mile point, and he had calculated that distance bought time. He had sent the text from a burner he'd kept hidden for 6 months for a moment exactly like this. "The vial Fortis was carrying," he said. "It's a concentrated cholinesterase inhibitor. A second exposure on top of what Drell already has, at his current state of recovery, would look like a relapse. It would be fast." "I have the vial," Mara said. "It's in evidence." A pause. Something that might have been relief. "Okay," he breathed. "Okay. The 40-mile point. It's a warehouse facility on the south side of the Renner Industrial District. Unit 14C. Voss has 2 people there. The plan was to transfer Drell from the installation under a secondary medical paperwork set. Fake deterioration. Rewrote. It's been done before." "Before," Rourke said. "There was another witness, 14 months ago. A contractor who worked one of the Nevada staging sites. It was transferred out of a secure facility on a medical pretext." A pause. "He didn't arrive at the destination." The hallway was very quiet. "How many people know the location of 14C?" Mara said. "On Voss's side, 3 including him. On yours, now just you 2. And me." "Where are you?" "Outside the coordination center. I took a vehicle from the adjacent lot. I have about..." A sound on his end, distant, something that might have been a door. "I need to move. Everything I just told you. I'll put it in writing. Full statement. Whatever you need. I'm done." The call ended. Rourke looked at Mara. "If he runs, he won't run far. He's been carrying this for 6 months, and it's already coming apart. He wants to put it down." She slipped her phone back into her pocket. "The 40-mile point, Renner Industrial, Unit 14C. That's where Voss is expecting Drell to arrive. If we can get people there before Voss realizes the transfer isn't happening. I need to reach someone above Voss's clearance level to lock him out of this operation before I can move on the warehouse." Rourke's voice was tight. "Otherwise, any action at that location is unauthorized and everything we pull out of it is tainted." "How close are you on the phone calls?" "I got through to a duty officer at the Inspector General's office 20 minutes ago. She's trying to reach the deputy. I'm waiting." "Keep waiting." Mara turned back toward the trauma bay. "I'm going back to Drell." "What?" What she found when she pushed through the bay door was Drell awake. Not alert, not functional, but awake, eyes open, tracking, with the foggy and slightly panicked quality of someone who had regained consciousness in an unfamiliar room and was working to understand why their body felt wrong. McDade was beside him, talking in the measured cadences of someone trained to orient confused patients, and Geary was at the door, and Taft was on the other side of the bed where Fortis had been, and the monitor was showing a blood pressure that had climbed to 112/74. She moved to Drell's side. "Marcus?" She waited until his eyes found her. "You're okay. You've been conscious before. You spoke to me about 20 minutes ago. Do you remember?" He looked at her for a moment. "The coordinates," he said. "I have them. I know about the 40-mile point." Something shifted in his face, tension going out of it, not all the way, but enough that she could see the particular relief of someone who has been holding a specific piece of information under pressure and has finally been able to hand it off. "The drive," he said, "at the hotel, secure." His eyes moved to McDade, then back to her. "Who?" "He's clean," she said. "So is the team, except Fortis, who is currently sitting in the waiting room." McDade, to his credit, absorbed this without visible reaction. He had clearly been recalibrating for the past hour and had arrived at some private set of conclusions that he was keeping orderly inside himself. "I need to authenticate the drive," Drell said. His voice was rough, and his words were slower than they'd be at full capacity, but the structure of his thinking was intact. "While I can. If I go under again, you're not going under again." She looked at his numbers. "But you're right that we should do it now." She looked at Rourke, who had followed her into the bay. "The case." Rourke made a call. The case was at the hotel with her 2 ground team members and a clear chain of custody. Transporting it back to the hospital took 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which Drell remained awake, incrementally improving, answering McDade's orientation questions with the labored but accurate responses of someone whose brain was finding its footing. He knew his name. He knew the date to within a day. He knew what had happened to him, and where he'd been going, and why. And he told McDade a version of it that was less complete than what he'd told Mara, but accurate in its architecture. McDade listened without interrupting. When Drell finished, McDade said, "You're telling me that my commanding officer on this operation is the target of the operation?" "Yes," Drell said. McDade was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant thing to tell a man whose career depends on correctly identifying who he takes orders from." "I know." "What am I supposed to do with it?" Drell looked at him. "Nothing yet. Let her—" He indicated Mara with a slight movement of his hand. "Do what she's doing, then decide." McDade looked at Mara. "I need about 40 more minutes," she said. He nodded once and stepped back. "Halt." The case arrived at 3:31 a.m. Rourke brought it in personally, set it on the supply counter, and stepped back. Drell reached for it and Mara steadied his arm. The IV was on the other side, but his hands were still unreliable, the fine motor control not yet fully returned from the chemical disruption. He pressed his thumb to the biometric strip. The case asked for voice confirmation. "Marcus Drell," he said, "Delta 77 Foxtrot 9. The case opened fully, the screen in the lid lit up, showing the complete file structure, not just the subfiles accessible through her single authentication, but everything. 47 months of records organized with the systematic, obsessive thoroughness of someone who had known that when this moment came, it would need to be unimpeachable. Mara looked at the file labeled Maintenance. She opened it. The coordinates for Renner Industrial, Unit 14C, were there, along with something she hadn't expected, a full operational map of the facility. Not a satellite image, not a rough sketch. A detailed internal layout, obtained somehow, showing entry points, the primary holding space, a secondary room at the back, and overlaid on the map in Drell's own handwriting, a notation that read, Evidence Storage Current. "He's been using it," she said. "For about 8 months, Drell said. His voice was stronger now, the rest and the blood pressure recovery doing their work. The product that doesn't go to the buyers, the overflow, the material that's too hot to move quickly. It goes to 14C. He's been accumulating it, insurance probably, in case he ever needed leverage against the buyers. A stockpile, Rourke said, of military medical material, some of it controlled, some of it, he paused, some of it in a category that is not supposed to exist outside of a very specific regulatory framework. The room absorbed that. If we get into that facility, Mara said, we don't just have Drell's documentation, we have the physical evidence, the actual material. Which is why he can't let Drell reach a facility where anyone independent can talk to him, Rourke said. The documentation alone is strong. The documentation plus the stockpile plus a coherent witness. It's done, Mara said. She looked at the clock on the bay wall. 3:38 a.m. She looked at Rourke. Where are we on the IG? Rourke's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Something moved across her face that Mara had not seen there before. Not relief, Not satisfaction, but the specific expression of someone who has been pushing against a locked door and has just heard the bolt turn. "Deputy IG is on the line," she said. "Right now." She stepped out of the bay. What happened in the next 22 minutes was the kind of thing that looks clean in retrospect and is not clean in the doing of it. The Deputy Inspector General, a woman whose voice Mara heard through the bay door in fragments, controlled and sharp, took 11 minutes to verify Rourke's credentials, assess the situation, and issue the authorization that removed Garrett Voss from operational command of anything connected to this case, effective immediately, pending formal investigation. That authorization went simultaneously to the Joint Logistics Command Duty Officer, to the IG Field Office, and to a federal law enforcement agency whose involvement Mara had not been aware of, but which Rourke had apparently been coordinating with for the past 3 weeks. The second thing that happened was that a field team from that agency, 7 people, not military, with the specific flat effect of federal investigators who have been awake for a long time and are very sure of what they're doing, arrived at Renner Industrial District, Unit 14C at 3:54 a.m. and secured the facility. They found 2 of Voss's people there. Neither of them resisted in any meaningful way, which Mara later thought said something about the difference between people who believe in what they're doing and people who are being paid for it. They also found what Drell's map had indicated: the stockpile. Organized, climate-controlled, meticulously inventoried in a system that matched the shadow records in Drell's documentation, with the kind of precision that made the evidentiary chain not just strong, but overwhelming. Mara knew all of this because Rourke told her in pieces, coming back into the bay between calls, each piece landing in the room with the quiet weight of something large and long suspended, finally making contact with the ground. She was sitting on the rolling stool beside Drell's bed when the most important piece arrived. "They have Voss," Rourke said. Mara looked up. He was at his residence. They sent people there as soon as the authorization came through. Standard procedure, lock down the subject before the news travels. Rourke paused. He apparently came to the door in civilian clothes and was cooperative. Didn't argue, didn't resist. Drell, who was awake and had been listening, said, "He knew." "What do you mean?" Rourke said. "Men like Voss, they know when it's over. They've been running a calculation the whole time, and at some point the calculation resolves." He was quiet for a moment. "He's already thinking about his next move. What he can trade, who he can give up to reduce his exposure." "He doesn't have much to trade," Rourke said. "We have the documentation, the stockpile, 2 people at the warehouse, and Fortis in the waiting room." "He'll trade anyway," Drell said. "It's what they do. Give up the buyers, give up the international contacts, try to make himself indispensable to the prosecution." He shifted slightly on the bed and winced. The movement still cost him. "Don't let him." "That's above my pay grade," Rourke said. "It's above mine too," Drell said. "But it matters." Mara had been listening to this exchange without speaking, and she was thinking about something else, about the file she'd seen in Drell's documentation, the one she'd found in the first authentication layer, the one that contained her own original report. The routing record. The 3 words Voss had sent to the Talbert Group's legal contact on the Thursday he'd received her full submission. She was thinking about the fact that what had been done to her was documented now. Not inferred, not alleged, documented. The routing record existed. The communication existed. The trail from her original report through Voss's review board to the Talbert Group contact was a line in a file that federal investigators were now reading. She was thinking about the 14 months she'd spent being Mara Sloan, the dropped charts and the silent meals and the careful invisibility, and the way it had felt not like safety, but like a long, slow erasure. "Rourke," she said, "my discharge paperwork, from 3 years ago, the performance evaluation." Rourke looked at her. "It's in the file." Drell flagged it specifically. The evaluation was drafted in coordination with Voss's office. The timing, the language, the scoring criteria applied to your case, and no comparable case in the same unit. It's documented. So it can be challenged. It can be reversed, Rourke said, and then more carefully. That's going to be a separate process, a formal one. It's not tonight. I know it's not tonight. She looked at the clock. 4:11 a.m. She looked at Hargrove, who had appeared in the bay doorway at some point in the past hour. She wasn't sure exactly when. and had been standing there with the expression of a man who had watched everything he understood about the hierarchy of his hospital be systematically dismantled and had not yet found the words for it. He had not spoken to her since the hallway. She had not needed him to. "Dr. Hargrove," she said. He looked at her. "The patient in Trauma Bay 2, the construction worker from earlier. Did someone update his family?" Hargrove blinked. The question was so far from what he'd been expecting that it took him a full 3 seconds to process it. He was transferred to the ICU. His family was notified. "And Devin Para," she said, "the 14-year-old from earlier in the shift. Has anyone followed up?" Another blink. I don't know who. He came in around 9:20 p.m., arm laceration. I flagged a respiratory concern in my discharge notes, and you told me to discharge him." She held Hargrove's gaze without particular heat, just steadiness. "I want to know if he's okay." Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and left the bay without speaking. She watched him go. "Who's Devin Para?" Rourke said. "A patient," Mara said, "from before all of this." At 4:39 a.m., two things happened within 4 minutes of each other. The first was that a nurse from the ICU appeared at the trauma bay door, looking for the nurse who had discharged Devin Para earlier in the evening. The boy had been brought back by his mother at 3 a.m. with worsening shortness of breath. An emergency chest X-ray had confirmed a small, spontaneous pneumothorax, exactly as Mara had suspected. He'd been treated, a small procedure, a chest tube, a recovery that would take days but had no complications. And he was stable. The nurse said the boy's mother had asked if she could find the person who had told her to come back if anything felt worse. Mara said she would come up in a few minutes. The second thing was a call to Rourke from the IG field office. Mara was close enough to hear the voice on the other end, and the words that mattered were these. Garrett Voss, Colonel, Joint Logistics Command, had been transported from his residence to a federal detention facility at 4:22 a.m. He had been formally notified of the charges against him, which included conspiracy, supply chain fraud, obstruction of official investigations, witness intimidation, and accessory to the murder of the federal contact found in his vehicle 2 miles from the hotel. He had said nothing after the charges were read. No trade offers, no cooperation, just silence. Drell, who was sitting partially upright and had been strong enough for the past 20 minutes to hold his own water cup, said when Rourke told him, "He'll talk eventually, when his lawyer explains the evidence." "You sound certain," Rourke said. "I'm certain of the evidence. The rest of it..." He looked tired. Not the chemical exhaustion of earlier, which had been an assault on his body. This was a different kind of tired. Men like that, they spend their whole career building a version of themselves that can't be wrong. When the version collapses, there's not much underneath it. He'll talk, because that's what's left to do. He paused. "I'm less interested in what he says than what happens after." Mara looked at the clock. 4:43 a.m. She was tired in a way that she hadn't let herself notice for the past several hours, because noticing it would have meant putting it somewhere, and there hadn't been anywhere to put it. It was not the clean exhaustion of physical effort, but the compound weight of 3 years of compression and 1 night of decompression, and the two things together had a quality she didn't have a precise word for. She was thinking about what came next, and what came next was a long and unglamorous series of formal processes, statements, reviews, documentation, the reversal of her discharge evaluation, the reconstruction of her service record, and all of it would take months and would not be simple, and would involve sitting in rooms with people who needed to understand what had happened, and would require her to explain it to them clearly and more than once. She was prepared for that. She had always been prepared for that. She had just needed the evidence to catch up. She stood up from the stool, straightened her coat, looked at Drell. "I'm going to check on a patient upstairs," she said. "Then I'll come back and we'll start the statement process." He nodded. His eyes had the quality of someone who wanted to say several things and had correctly identified that none of them were quite right for this moment. "Marsh," he said finally. She waited. "You saved my life tonight," he said. She thought about the 14 months, the drop chart on day 3, the small, careful habits, the water bottle she refilled 4 times a shift, the invisible, considered work of a person who had been filed under unremarkable and had stayed there willingly because she didn't know yet what she was waiting for. "Yes," she said. "I did." She walked to the bay door, pushed through it, and went down the hall toward the elevator that would take her to the ICU on the fourth floor, where a 14-year-old boy's mother was waiting to thank the nurse who had paid attention when no one else thought it was worth the effort. She was in the elevator, alone, when her phone rang. Unknown number. Different from the one Solis had used. She answered it. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a voice she did not recognize, male, older, flat, with the specific quality of someone who was not calling to negotiate. "Sergeant Marsh," the voice said, "you've had a busy night." She kept her face neutral even though she was alone. "I don't know who this is." "No," the voice said. "You don't. But you know the name Talbert, and you know that Garrett Voss was one node in a network." A pause. "Not the top node." The elevator reached the fourth floor and the doors opened. She stood in the elevator and did not step out. "Voss gave us everything we needed," she said carefully. "Voss gave you what Voss knew," the voice said, "which is less than you think. The Talbert group has 3 principles. Voss knew one of them. The other 2, another pause, deliberate, the pause of someone who had thought carefully about exactly how much to say. The other 2 are considerably harder to reach, and they are aware that tonight did not go according to plan. She looked at the open elevator doors. The ICU hallway was visible, nursing station, low light, the quiet, purposeful sounds of a ward at 4 a.m. "What do you want?" she said. "The same thing Drell wanted," the voice said. "But Drell only had half the map." A pause. "You've just authenticated a drive that contains the half he built. The other half doesn't exist yet," she said. "It exists," the voice said. "It's just not in a drive. It's in a building, a specific building, in a city you've been to before, under a name you'll recognize." A long pause. "And in approximately 6 hours, the people who own that building are going to know that the node they relied on is gone, and they are going to start removing what's in it." The elevator doors began to close. She put her hand out and stopped them. "How do I know you're not one of them?" she said. The voice said, "Because if I were, you'd already be dead." The line went dead. She stood in the open elevator with her hand against the door and looked at the ICU hallway and thought about a boy named Devin who was breathing steadily 4 rooms down because someone had paid attention, and she thought about a drive sitting in a case in a trauma bay 2 floors below her, and she thought about a second half of a map that she had not known existed 20 seconds ago. The doors wanted to close. She kept her hand against them. She stepped out of the elevator. Not because she had decided what to do about the phone call. She hadn't. She stepped out because Devin Para's mother was 4 rooms down that hallway and had been waiting since 3 a.m., and whatever came next could wait 6 more minutes. The ICU charge nurse directed her to room 412, without asking for identification, which told her that Hargrove had made a call up here before she arrived. The thought of that cost her something she couldn't immediately name. Room 412 was dim, the overhead off and only the soft monitoring light and a small lamp by the bed making any brightness. Devin was asleep. His mother was in the chair beside him, still in her coat, and she stood up when Mara came in. She was a tall woman, probably early 40s, with dark circles that went deeper than one lost night, and the particular vigilance in her posture of someone who had learned not to trust that things would be fine without her watching. She looked at Mara, and then she did something Mara had not expected. She didn't say thank you. She didn't speak at all for a moment. She just looked at her the way people look at someone when the words for the thing they feel are not available in any language they have access to. Then she said, "He was scared when they put the tube in. He kept asking if you were still here." Mara looked at Devin. He was pale, but his breathing was easy and even, the chest tube doing its quiet, unglamorous work. "He's going to be fine," she said. "I know." The mother sat back down. "They told me. But I wanted to say, you told me, last night. You told me to bring him back if anything changed." "I did. Everyone else said it was fine." "I know." The mother looked at her son and then at Mara. "Why did you tell me? When everyone else said fine?" Mara thought about how to answer that. The honest version was long and tangled and involved. 14 months of watching herself become invisible, and 3 years before that of learning that the things you notice when you pay close attention are not less real because no one else is paying attention. The shorter version was simpler. "Because I looked at him," she said, "and something wasn't right, so I told you." The mother nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said finally. Mara stayed another 2 minutes. She checked Devon's monitor without touching anything. The numbers were good, better than good. And then she put her hand briefly on the doorframe on her way out, the way you touch something solid when you need to mark a moment without making a ceremony of it. She went back to the elevator. She called Rourke from inside it. "I got a call," she said when Rourke picked up. "Unknown number, male voice, older. He says Voss was one node. He says there are 2 more principals in the Talbert group that Voss didn't have visibility on. He says they have 6 hours before those principals know the network has been compromised and start clearing evidence from a specific location." Silence on Rourke's end for 2 seconds. "That's either the second half of the case or it's a setup." "I know." "Which do you think it is?" Mara thought about the voice, the specific flat quality of it, the way it had offered information without asking for anything in return, at least not yet. The way it had ended the call before she could ask more questions, which was either discipline or theater, and the two were hard to distinguish on a 4-minute phone call at 4:47 in the morning. "I think it's real," she said. "I think someone has been watching this operation for a long time, from a position that gave them access to the parts Drell couldn't reach. And I think they've been waiting for a moment when enough of the structure had collapsed that coming forward was survivable." "Why now? Why tonight?" "Because Voss is arrested and the stockpile is secured and the documentation is in federal hands. The people above Voss just lost their primary insulation. Whoever this is, they're not safe anymore whether they talk or stay quiet. So they're choosing to talk while what they have is still worth something." The elevator opened on the first floor. She walked back toward the trauma bay. "I need you to run the voice call through whatever you have," she said. "And I need Drell conscious and strong enough to look at a file reference. He may know what building the caller is describing." "He's been asking for you," Rourke said. "He said he has something else to tell you." "Of course he does." The trauma bay had changed in the 40 minutes she'd been gone. The equipment density had reduced, some of the acute monitoring had been stepped down as Drell's stability held, and the room felt less like a resuscitation space and more like a room where someone was simply recovering. Drell was sitting up at a 30-degree incline, his color substantially better, holding a cup of water with a steadiness his hands had not had an hour ago. Geary and Taft were still there. McDade was in the corner writing in a notebook, which she noted because it was not a tablet and not a formal report format. It was a personal notebook, the kind you carry when you want a record that belongs only to you. She went to Drell's bedside. "You got a call," he said before she could speak. She looked at him. "Rourke told you." "Rourke told me there was a call. She didn't tell me the content." His eyes were clear now, which made a difference. Full wakefulness had a different quality than the effortful consciousness of an hour ago. "The building he described. What city?" "He didn't name a city. He said I'd been there before and I'd recognize the name of the building." Drell was quiet for a moment. "Meridian Storage. It's in Kelson, about 4 hours south of here. I found a reference to it in the Talbert Group's financial records. It appeared twice under a subsidiary name, routed through a real estate holding company. I couldn't verify what it was. I flagged it in the file, but I didn't have enough to build on it. It's in your documentation. As an anomaly, not an asset." She thought about that. An anomaly in Drell's documentation that the caller knew was connected to the 2 principals above Voss, which meant the caller had either built that connection himself or been inside the operation at a level that gave him visibility. Drell had been unable to access from the outside. "He knew your name," she said. Drell looked up. "He called me Sergeant Marsh, which means he has access to information about this operation that goes beyond what's been public tonight." She held his gaze. "Who knows about your documentation, the specific content, the gaps, the names in the file?" "Rourke, the IG contact, the federal team." He paused. "And the people I built the file about." "Voss." "Voss and anyone Voss briefed." He set the water cup down carefully. "If there are 2 principals above Voss, and one of them is trying to separate themselves from the network tonight, he'd know everything Voss knew," she said, "including my name, including the gap in your documentation." She paused. "He's not a witness. He's a principal who's deciding the network is finished and wants to be on the right side of it before the walls come down." Drell absorbed that. "That changes what he's worth." It changes everything about what he's worth. He's not someone who watched from a distance and is willing to talk. He's someone who built this with Voss and knows the full structure from the inside. If he's willing to give us the second principle and the meridian storage contents, he'll want something for it. He'll want everything for it. She looked at Drell. That's not your call or mine. That's federal prosecutors and the IG, and it's going to take months. Months during which he could disappear. Which is why the call matters right now, the 6-hour window. If we can get people to meridian storage before it's cleared, we have the physical evidence. Whether or not he cooperates formally, whether or not he gets a deal, the material at that location is what closes the remaining case. Drell looked at her for a long moment. You're going to tell Rourke. I already called her from the elevator. And? And she's making calls. She checked the time, 5:01 a.m. We have until approximately 10 a.m. before the window closes, which is more time than it sounds because Kelson is 4 hours out, and the people we need to authorize the operation need to be awake enough to authorize it correctly. Drell nodded slowly. Then he looked at her with the particular directness of someone who has decided to say the thing they've been not saying. I've been building this case for 14 months, he said, and I've known where you were for most of that time. I told myself I was protecting you by not making contact, that pulling on that thread would expose your location to the wrong people before I had enough to make it worth the risk. She waited. That was partly true, he said, and partly, I didn't know how to have the conversation about what I didn't do 3 years ago, about the inquiry. I kept building the file because the file was a thing I could control, and the conversation was a thing I couldn't. She thought about the 14 months, the specific weight of them, not just the invisibility. She had chosen the invisibility, and she understood why she'd chosen it. But the knowledge underneath it, the knowledge that what had been done to her had been done deliberately, and the people who had done it were still in place and still operational. She had carried that every day. Not loudly, not in a way that required managing. Just as a fact, present the way a weight is present, constant, and unremarkable. You built the case, she said. It's built. That's what matters now. It's not enough, he said. It's not, professionally, the file is strong. But what happened to you wasn't just a professional injury. You lost. I know what I lost. I know you do. He looked down at his hands. The scar on the web of his right thumb was visible from this angle. I'm sorry, Marsh, not as a formal statement or a legal position. Just, I'm sorry. She looked at him for a moment. He was not a simple person to have feelings about. He had failed her in a specific and consequential way, and had spent 14 months trying to repair it at significant personal risk, and neither of those things canceled the other out. People were rarely either the good version or the bad version of themselves. They were usually both, in different proportions at different moments. I know, she said. That was all. It was enough. Well, the authorization for the Meridian storage operation came through at 6:14 a.m., issued by the Deputy IG's office in coordination with the federal team that had secured Unit 14C. The team deployed at 6:31. Mara knew this because Rourke told her standing in the hallway outside the trauma bay with 2 cups of terrible hospital coffee, one of which she handed to Mara without ceremony. The coffee was bad. Mara drank it. The caller, Rourke said. We ran the number. It was a burner, activated 6 days ago. But the signal tower it hit at the time of the call puts it in the Callaway Ridge general vicinity. He was nearby. Close enough to be watching the hospital, close enough to know in real time what was happening here. Rourke wrapped both hands around her cup. Which means he's been in this city for at least 6 days, which means he came here specifically. For the handoff, Mara said. He knew about Drell's meeting. He may have been trying to create a backup plan in case it went wrong. Or he caused it to go wrong. She had considered that. It was possible. The kind of person who exists above Voss in a network like this doesn't get there by being straightforward, and the decision to call her tonight rather than to simply disappear was the decision of someone playing a specific game with a specific end in mind. She wasn't naive about that. But the Meridian storage operation would proceed regardless of his motives, and the material at that location would be what it was, regardless of why he'd told her about it. We'll know more when the team reaches Kelson, she said. Rourke nodded. In the meantime, Hargrove filed a formal incident report at 5 a.m., covering tonight's events at the hospital. The report is accurate, which surprised me, but I think he didn't see an alternative given the number of witnesses. What does the report say? That a former nurse, he uses the word former, identified a critical exposure pattern in an incoming patient, provided emergency treatment that stabilized the patient pending specialist arrival, and remained on site to coordinate with responding federal personnel. Rourke paused. He doesn't use your name. He uses your employee ID number. Mara thought about that. Hargrove writing an accurate report was the action of a man who had understood, somewhere in the hours between the soldiers arriving and 5 a.m., that the ground under his authority had fundamentally shifted, and that the version of events most likely to survive scrutiny was the one closest to what had actually happened. It was not an apology. It was not accountability. It was a man doing the minimum necessary calculation to protect himself. She did not mistake it for more than that, and she did not need it to be more than that. The hospital board is meeting this morning, Rourke continued. It was already scheduled, routine, but the incident report will be on the agenda. She looked at her coffee cup. The IG office is sending a formal notice to the board regarding potential interference with a federal medical case. It's not a criminal referral, but it's on the record. Hargrove will keep his license, Mara said. Not a question, a read of the situation. Probably. He'll have a difficult 12 months, board review, formal censure in the incident record. His relationship with the residents is going to be different. Rourke looked at her. That might matter more than any formal sanction. Mara thought about Kaplan, the resident who had stood across the bed from her in the worst 22 minutes of the night and held the second line steady and stayed verbal when she'd told him to. Kaplan had watched Hargrove dismiss her. Kaplan had also watched what happened after. That was a thing that would live in his practice for the rest of his career, the specific knowledge that the person being dismissed was not wrong. Those were small turnings, invisible from a distance, but medicine moved on them. The call from Kelson came at 9:52 a.m. Mara was in the dictation room, the same one with the coffee stain on the whiteboard frame, giving her formal statement to an IG field officer named Pratt, a meticulous woman in her 50s who asked questions slowly and wrote every answer down by hand, even though she also had a recorder running. The process was not fast and it was not comfortable, but it was thorough, and thoroughness was what she needed it to be. Rourke knocked, opened the door, and held up her phone. Mara looked at Pratt. 1 minute. She stepped into the hallway. Meridian Storage, Rourke said. The team got in at 9:38. It took 20 minutes to assess the facility. She paused, and in the pause was the weight of something significant. The second principal was there. Mara went still. In person. He was in the facility when the team arrived. He did not resist. He had a legal representative with him, which means he knew the team was coming. Rourke looked at her. He had already started organizing the contents of the facility for handover. There were 8 crates ready at the loading dock. He staged it, Mara said. He staged it precisely. The crates contained financial records, operational communications, and physical documentation covering the full network from inception, not just the Talbert Group, not just the supply diversion, the full structure. International contacts, buyer records, the Nevada and East Coast staging facilities, the original setup of the shell companies. Rourke's voice was controlled, but something moved underneath it. This is the complete case, Marsh, not the half Drell built. The whole thing. She stood in the hallway and let that land. 47 months of Drell's documentation, which was already more than enough to prosecute Voss and dismantle the domestic operation. And now, staged in 8 crates at a loading dock in Kelson by a man who had decided that whatever deal he could negotiate was better than the alternative. The full structure of the thing she had first tried to report on a Tuesday in February 3 years ago. The second principal, she said, the one who was there. Who is he? Rourke told her the name. She didn't know it personally, but she knew the company it was attached to, a contracting firm that appeared in the periphery of Drell's documentation as a financial affiliate, never centered, always adjacent. The kind of name you look at and move past because it doesn't flag, because its positioning has been designed to not flag. That was the work. Not the dramatic center of the network, but the careful edges of it, built by someone who understood that the most durable corruption is the kind that looks like something else. And the third principle, she said? Unknown. The man in Kelson says he doesn't know the identity of the third contact. All communications went through an intermediary, a communication protocol that the forensics team is going to need weeks to trace. Rourke paused. He may be telling the truth. In a structure like this, compartmentalization serves everyone. Or he knows, and it's the most valuable thing he has left to trade. Also possible? She looked at the wall. The third contact, someone above both Voss and the man in Kelson, reached only through an intermediary protocol that would take weeks to unpeel. The person who had called her on the burner phone from somewhere near this hospital had been the second principal, staging his cooperation and using her as a channel to deliver the Kelson location to federal authorities in a way that was unofficial enough to give him time to set up the handover on his terms. It was manipulative, and it was also, from a purely operational standpoint, effective. The third principle was a different problem. A longer problem, not tonight's problem. The IG field office will handle the trace, Rourke said. It's not on us to finish it. We broke open the structure. The rest of it is a federal investigation that's going to run for a long time. I know. Mara looked at the dictation room door. I need to finish the statement. There's one more thing. Rourke looked at her steadily. The deputy IG signed the formal inquiry into your service discharge this morning. Given the documentation in Drell's file, the routing record, the communication to the Talbert Group legal contact, the performance evaluation irregularities, the inquiry is expected to conclude within 60 days. The legal standard for reversal is met on its face. A pause. Your record, Marsh. Your actual record. It's going to be corrected. She had known it was coming. Rourke had told her last night that it was a separate process, a formal one, not tonight's work. She had understood that and set it aside and focused on what needed to be done in the immediate hours. Standing in the hallway at 9:55 a.m. with the statement half finished and the Kelson news still settling, she understood it differently than she had at 3 a.m. Her record, 3 years of a discharge evaluation that said she was unreliable and unfit and insufficiently competent to carry the designation she had spent 8 years earning. 3 years of Mara Sloan, the clumsy nurse, the invisible presence, the woman people looked at and passed without registering. 3 years of choosing a smaller life over a fought-for one because the people who had the power to adjudicate the fight were connected to the people she was fighting against. It was going to be corrected, not repaired. You couldn't repair 3 years. You couldn't give them back. The nights and the water bottle and the careful invisibility and the moment on day 3 with the scattered chart pages and Hargrove's smile that didn't reach his eyes in the department meeting and 14 months of being the person nobody needed to think about. All of that had happened and correction didn't unhappen it. But the record was the record. And the record was going to tell the truth. She breathed in once, let it out, and went back into the dictation room to finish her statement. The formal hearing before the Army Review Board convened 51 days later, in a building she had been in before under different circumstances, with different expectations of how she would leave it. She wore the dress uniform she had not touched in 3 years. It still fit, though the fit was slightly different than she remembered. She had been a different person the last time she'd worn it, not physically, but in the way that people are different when they're still inside a thing versus standing at the edge of it, looking back. Rourke was there. Drell was there, still thinner than he'd been before the exposure and moving slightly carefully, which the doctor said would resolve over time, and which he treated as an inconvenience rather than a limitation. He had submitted a 40-page supplemental affidavit to the board, beyond his formal testimony, covering in precise and documented detail the construction of the operation that had been used to end her career. The routing record was Exhibit 7. The 3 words, "It's been contained," were in 12-point font on a document that had a government seal on the top and would be part of the permanent record. Pratt from the IG office was there. The federal team leads from Unit 14C and from Kelson were there. Kaplan was there, in civilian clothes, because he had submitted a voluntary witness statement about the events of the night at Callaway Ridge, and the board had called him to verify it. Hargrove was not there. He had submitted a written statement, which was accurate, and which she had read and which she had no particular feelings about beyond noting that it was accurate. Garrett Voss was not there. I was in federal detention awaiting trial on 6 counts, having rejected a cooperation agreement that would have required him to identify the 3rd Talbert principal. His lawyer was still working on him. The IG field office's trace on the intermediary communication protocol was still running. The board took 2 hours and 14 minutes. The result was what it was always going to be once the evidence was laid in front of people with the authority to read it without a political filter. The discharge evaluation was formally vacated. Her service record was restored. Her rank was reinstated with all associated recognition intact. The board chair, a general she'd never met, gray-haired and economical with expression in the way of people who have spent a long time in rooms where expression costs, read the finding aloud in a voice that had no ceremony in it, just precision. She appreciated the precision. When it was done, she stood in a hallway outside the hearing room with Rourke beside her and Drell a few feet away talking to Pratt, and she thought about what she expected to feel and measured it against what she actually felt. She had expected something larger. Resolution was supposed to feel like something arriving, something final and complete and distinctly different from everything before it. The stories she had absorbed over a lifetime set that expectation, and the reality of standing in a hallway at 2:37 p.m. on a Tuesday was that she felt tired in a way that was almost peaceful and relieved in a way that was quieter than relief had any right to be, and aware that the thing she was most conscious of was a faint hunger, because she had eaten a protein bar at 7 a.m. and nothing since. The world did not reorganize itself around moments of justice. It kept moving, requiring the same things it had always required: food, sleep, forward motion. The justice was real. It was also just one thing, occurring inside a life that continued past it. Drell came over when Pratt moved away. He looked at her. "How do you feel?" he said. "Hungry?" she said. He laughed, a short, genuine sound, the kind that happens when an answer is unexpected and right at the same time. "There's a decent diner 2 blocks from here. I've been to it before." "I know," she said. "I walked past it on the way in." They went to the diner. Rourke came too, and Kaplan, who had taken the day off from his residency and was slightly formal in the way of young people in situations they're not quite sure how to inhabit. They ate real food at a table by a window and talked about things that were not the operation: Kaplan's upcoming rotation in critical care, Rourke's bureaucratic complaints about the IG reporting structure, Drell's opinion on the diner's coffee versus the hospital's coffee, which was not a high bar. It was an ordinary lunch. She ate everything on her plate and drank 2 cups of coffee and felt the specific pleasure of ordinary things after a long time of carefully curated invisibility. 3 weeks after this board hearing, she received an offer. It came through official channels, a formal letter addressed to Sergeant First Class Lena Marsh from the Office of the Inspector General in coordination with a federal task force whose full name she was not going to repeat in casual conversation. The offer was for a consulting position, structured around cases involving military supply chain integrity and internal misconduct, drawing on her combined background in combat medicine and operational experience. It was not a return to active service. It was something that didn't have a clean prior category, which suited her. She took 3 days to think about it. On the 3rd day, she called a number she'd looked up that morning, a pediatric pulmonology follow-up clinic attached to a hospital system 2 miles from Callaway Ridge. She asked for the nurse coordinator and explained that she was trying to follow up on a patient named Devin Para, age 14, who had been treated for a spontaneous pneumothorax approximately 2 months ago. She was not family. She could not access his records. The coordinator was professionally courteous and told her nothing. She was not surprised. She asked the coordinator to pass along a message, if appropriate, that a nurse who had been working at Callaway Ridge the night he was admitted had been hoping to hear he was doing well. She did not leave her name. She accepted the consulting offer the same afternoon. She did not return to Callaway Ridge. She had no reason to and several reasons not to, and the reasons not to were not primarily about Hargrove, though Hargrove existed among them. The reasons were simpler than that. She had spent 14 months being one version of herself in that building, and the building would always contain that version, and she was done with versions. What she was what she had always been. A person who paid attention when others didn't find it worth the effort. A person whose training had given her tools that didn't disappear when the institution that had trained her tried to rescind them. A person who had made a choice on a Tuesday in February 3 years ago to file a report she knew might end her career because the alternative was remaining silent about something that was causing real harm to real people. And she was not constituted for that alternative, had never been, despite considerable pressure to become so. The pressure had not worked. That was worth knowing. 6 months after the hearing, on a morning in late autumn, when the light came in low and gray through the window of an office she had recently acquired, small, functional, with a government-issue desk that had belonged to several people before her. She was reviewing a case file that had come in the previous day when her desk phone rang. She picked up. "Sergeant Marsh." A voice she didn't know. Female. Brisk. "This is the intake coordinator at the IG field office in Westbrook. We've had a referral, a military hospital system, with a pattern of supply discrepancies that don't match their stated audit results. The case officer thinks it might be similar in structure to what you worked on last year." A pause. "Are you available for an intake call this afternoon?" She looked at the case file in front of her. She looked at the low gray light through the window. She thought about a woman in a hospital chair in her coat at 4 a.m., sitting beside her son, waiting. She thought about a young resident whose hands had stopped shaking. She thought about a drive in a sealed case and a routing record in 12-point font and 8 crates at a loading dock and the long, unglamorous work of building something out of fragments that people in power had decided should not exist. She thought about the fact that the third Talbert principle was still unidentified, still somewhere in the structure of things, still believing that the distance between themselves and the evidence was sufficient. It was not sufficient. She knew how to find things that had been designed not to be found. "Yes," she said, "I'm available." She pulled out a fresh notepad, the same brand she had always used. Nothing special about it, just a thing she'd bought in bulk because it was the right size and the paper took ink without bleeding. She wrote the date at the top of the first page. She drew a line under it. She had never stopped being good at this work. 3 years of a smaller life had not diminished it. A fraudulent evaluation had not diminished it. 14 months of dropped charts and careful invisibility had not diminished it. The things you're built for don't require permission to remain true. She had hidden what she was because she thought it would protect her. She had learned, over the course of one long night in a hospital she no longer worked at, that hiding it had never actually been protection. It had only been waiting, and waiting was not the same as being safe. It was just a longer way of arriving at the same place. The intake coordinator was talking. She wrote down what mattered and waited for the part she needed, and when it came, she wrote that down too. In the same handwriting she had used to fill out 14 months of nursing documentation, exact and unhurried, belonging to someone who had never been what people assumed when they looked at her, who had always been exactly what she was, who was finally,